Hambini fans, and welcome to another episode of Hambini Reams. In today's episode, which I might add, has been done by a tall twat from Marseille because 18 people emailed in and asked me to do it. Talk about peer pressure. Anyway, now before I continue, I must give credit where it's due, and that is to Specialized Marketing Department, who are masters at generating hype and managing to bury things that are relevant but you don't want to hear about. By Hambini, age 5, let me to the pen check. The pen is working. We need plenty of pen action today. Right. So this is the bike. I've seen it advertised in a few places. That price might not be totally accurate, but you're looking at somewhere around 14,000 big ones. Or if your name is Vaginal Twat, 350 chicks with appendages from Bangkok. On the top right is the old SL7. So we say old. Now on the face of it, there isn't really that much difference between that one and the white bike, which is the new one. I mean, the most striking feature is the longer corded head tube, which aesthetically may not be so pleasing, but if you ask me, this item, which Specialized has called the Coke Snorter, it's just a belt and braces way of avoiding a reaming from the authorities for having a shite steering system. Now, if you're new to all of this, Specialized had some problems with the SL7 with the steering tube snapping. They knew about it for quite some time, and they only issued a recall when they already had the spares to avoid, upsetting their barrister friends. Now, some other features on this bike. The handlebars are different. So this one is, I say it's a lot more aggressive. It's basically flatter. It's one piece, so you can't adjust the rotation, and there's no stem per se, no separate stem. And the other piece, which I looked at first when I saw it, is this tube. So the seat tube is considerably deeper than on the old bike, so that's reduced this clearance through here, so that's aerodynamically quite good. And also the stays, you have to look a bit harder, look to be narrower. Now we come on to the aerodynamic credentials of this bike, and they're billing it as one bike does it all. Now the headline claim is it does 40 kilometers 16.6 seconds faster. Now, it doesn't actually say what speed they're doing for that claim or which dentist they've hired to sit on the bike to substantiate that claim. So I had to do some guesswork, so it's probably wrong. But I should emphasise that there is little doubt to anyone with a hint of training that they've deliberately done this to prevent accusations of false advertising. Now the general public is a lot more aware than they once were. Now, if you factor in the maths, which is basically over here, you basically get a CDA. I think the CDA saving is about 0.04. So, and that there's a load of assumptions in there. I mean, I don't know what the rolling resistance of the tyres are, or the transmission, all that kind of stuff. But anyway, that's what I've got. And it also doesn't take into account the frontal area of the bike, because the A term in CDA is your drag coefficient multiplied by the frontal area. So my conclusion in all this will be to ignore that number, because I think it's been frigged. It does, however, correspond nicely to the figure that was quoted by the head of wanketeering and expectation management for Specialized, a guy called Mike Hubbard, who said it was about 4 watts. So that does sort of tally up. Now you can actually view the equations that I use on my website. Have a look for Real World Cycling Aerodynamics. A lot of people just use a plain CD number, but you can use a drag polar, which for this comparison will probably be a bit better. This is a comparison between the bars. The obvious difference is in the depth. Yeah. And the stem. It's been smoothed out. Now personally, I think it's always better to go for bars that give you the adjustment, unless you are an exact fit on the bike. There's the aerodynamic loss from your hand position will be way more than the cutting edge aero. And that brings me on to the steering system. Now, I lifted these photos from Escape Collective. The routing is through the top bearing, so it's an 1.5 inch bearing. Now, for a long time, Specialized used to use AC, I think it was 808F, which was an 1.25 inch bearing. I think looking at that, they might have moved to an 1.5 inch. Anyway, the routing is through here, and it uses a massive, reinforcement tube. I don't think there were taking any chances this time around. I mean, look at that. That is massive. That's probably the biggest one I've ever seen, apart from my own. Anyway, they've made a conscious decision here. I'm not sure it was a particularly good one, to move the bearing back from the coke snorter. I imagine that was probably to keep the same geometry, so the rake angle of the steering remained the same. But from an aerodynamic perspective, I think that's not a great idea, because if you have the bearing like that, you want this section to be as deep as possible, as long as possible. What they've ended up with is the coke snorter there, and the taper is not as long because you have to comply with the 3:1 UCI rule. So yeah, less of an aerodynamic gain. Interestingly, this shot over here shows the internal routing of the Specialized bike, and it uses an almost identical system to this, which is my $500 light carbon gravel bike. I've seen this system on a few others, so Windspace, Yoleo and Elvis. They use the same system, and it's pretty widely used, and the Specialized system looks to be almost a carbon copy of it. Just the plastic assembly is slightly different, but the routing method is the same, so it's a proven design really. Now, aesthetically, I don't really like the coke snorter. I think they prefer the System 6. It moves the bearing further forward. I mean, you still do have some limitations as to how tightly you can turn the steering, but aerodynamically, it's superior because you've got a longer taper. Now, as many of you know, I do insurance claims for injury and functional failures. As many of you know, I do insurance claims for injury and functional failures. The firm that I do a lot of that stuff for sent me some data around those claims. So I plotted this on a pie chart to show you graphically how failures that cause injuries pan out. Now, there is a bit of overlap in these, so you'll have to take that as it is. The biggest chunk by some margin are steering failures. This kind of came about for a desire to move towards hidden routing. So the cables and hoses went through very tight bend radii and low torque settings, and fatigue and fretting was often an unavoidable outcome, and this caused the fails. Now, I'm pretty sure Specialized will know about this because they've been subject to many recalls, but it's not just them. You've had Trek, Cervelo, Cannondale, all the others. Interestingly, the second biggest one is the bike shop. So build errors are, rife, absolutely rife. The bottom bracket is not something that people have really spoken about, and if you are using Shimano crankset, you probably don't need to even consider it. Now, I did pull this interesting piece from the Specialized manual. It implies in here the bike is ready face when you get it. That'll be a first. Now, because Specialized have stuck with 68mm, it's kind of a legacy of their OSBB system, which was basically BB30. It doesn't take much engineering to go from BB30 to BSA. In contrast, going from BB30 to T47 I86 is a big difference. And herein lies the problem. If you're fitting a dub or a 30mm axle into BSA holes, you end up with quite a flexible system. The sidewalls around here for the thread engagement are so thin the metal can flex. Some of the race people that I supply BSA or BSA to dub hardware pretty much all go for titanium now. Sorry. Now under load they say they can detect flex, and some heavy riders have also said the same thing. Now I think it's possibly a lack of engineering resources or providing engineering resources in other areas that's pushed Specialized to sticking to BSA, or even possibly their quest for reduced weight. But you know, that's one thing that I think they should have done. Now the weight savings are quite impressive. The number quoted in a few places is like around 700 grams. That they've done that by going to smaller sections and possibly even thinner sidewalls. I mean, the sections look visibly smaller, but the sidewalls, whether they're thinner or not, only time will tell. Someone will have to UT them to find out. Now these two shapes are equally stiff, but they represent two ends of the spectra in terms of aerodynamics and weight. The critical parameter, which is the second moment of area, means you'll end up with a brick of a shape, so there is a compromise to be had there. The other blatant thing is verging on lying and stiffness and compliance. Compliance in the bike industry generally means the ability to dampen out vibrations. If you make the bike very stiff, you cannot improve the compliance. Flexibility in the frame is required to dissipate the energy associated with vibration. By definition, if a frame is infinitely stiff, it has no compliance. So there you go. A side effect from, you know, some of my colleagues mentioned this, from having very thin walls is that of skin buckling. Now this is common in pre-stressed structures, and there's an aeroplane as an example, B-52. If you have tension skin between stiffened members, so think of this as the intersections of the frame tubes being stiff and the bits in between being, you know, thin, the skin, you can end up with localized skin buckling, and having thin walls is very much a precursor or a trigger for it. In this case, you're much more likely to puncture it than anything else because the wall is thin. It's actually weak in that buckling direction. And that is the end of this presentation. If you did enjoy it, remember to smash that like button and hit subscribe. If you didn't, go screw yourself. And as always, keep banging your hairdresser.